You know, I used to go to the Hidden Children conferences, and I haven't been for many, many years, and I thought, geez, some of the people I'm sure are gone, and I mean, they're having second and third generation now that come and whatever. It's interesting. One time we had, at a conference, we had some World War II vets who had actually been at the camps, and when they, and we honored them and everything. It was very, very moving because they were, saying how they found them. Yeah. They were the real people. So
we used to have some liberators in our speakers bureau.
Did you?
Yeah, there was a fellow from Whidbey Island named Leo Hymas, who helped liberate one of the subcamps of Dachau when he was an 18-year-old
Wow.
guy.
That must have been something, because some of these people looked like skeletons.
Yeah.
It must have, very traumatic. And a lot of these guys were young guys. To see that, and it's just like, well, the whole experience.
No, he would say it had such a profound impact on his life, and that he spoke about it, the groups for the rest of his life.
Okay, well, okay. Are we ready? Oh, no lights? Oh, those are the lights. Okay. Yeah. You mean we're ready?
Well,
yeah,
I'm ready.
Oh, you are? Okay.
But the thing to remember also, I think, with Richard is, if you want to take a break, you can take a break. If you want to say something again, you can say something again.
If you don't like the way you said it.
We're here for as long as you want to talk.
Oh my gosh.
We're here for, as short.
You're here for 2 days, 3 days, it's all right.
If you feel like you want us to come back after the day, sure, we could do that.
You're cute.
No, this is really, I think I feel really thankful to be here with you. I feel thankful to have this opportunity, and I know that testimony has been hugely important to me and how I live in the world, so, I'm grateful that Richard's asked me to be part of this. And,
wow. Yeah. It's wonderful to hear you say that, and the way you feel. You're emotional, and that's very nice. That's really lovely. So shall I start then? Okay.
Let's begin.
So,
hi.
Oh,
my name is.
Hi. My name is Agi Day, and I was born on May 13th, 1940. I was born in Belgrade, Yugoslavia. At that time, it was called Yugoslavia. Of course, now it's called Serbia. And my mother was Hungarian, and my father was Serbian. And I just fairly recently found out that they really only were married in 1938. My mother met my father in Budapest. I had an older sister from my mother's previous marriage, and she was 12 and a half years older than me. And so we obviously lived in Belgrade, and then war broke out.
What was your name when you were born?
Oh dear. I always talked about my mother because my mother, being Hungarian, didn't matter. She decided to name me a Yugoslavian name, Serbian name. And it's always been, I have always told, I hated that name, always hated the name, but that's what's my name. It was Zagorka Herzog. My father's name was Herzog. So Zagorka. Well, apparently, when my sister, who was a very proud, just before the war broke out, she used to walk me in the carriage. And it was interesting because in Belgrade, when people admired a baby, they used to put money under the pillow of the carriage. So they put money under my pillow, and so of course my sister was very happy. She took me for a lot of walks because she got the money. But basically, how did I get to be called Agi? Which my sister, Zagorka, was a difficult name to pronounce and probably didn't like it, as I never liked it, and I've never ever in my life been called Zagorka, ever. Because my sister started to call me Zagi, and from Zagi came Agi, and actually Agi, A-G-I, is a very popular Hungarian name, and it's pronounced Agi. Of course, it's Agi here, but it's Agi, and that's how I became Agi. And later on in school and whenever, I just never went by that name, Zagorka. It's on my birth certificate, and that's about it. And actually, when I became an American citizen, and I'm jumping ahead, in 1986, you have a chance when you become a citizen to change your name, just like that. So I did. I actually changed it officially to Agi. But in the meantime, I have all these different degrees, and they are Agnes and Aggie, and it's just different names in every single certificate I have. So it's funny. But that's how I became Agi. Well, Warwick. Oh,
Can you tell us a little about your family? Tell me about your parents. Tell me about your sister. What were their names? When
okay.
they were
My
born?
sister's name was Veronica, and my mother was married before, and her father's name was Rezső, which is a Hungarian name, and he really, I later on in my life, I knew him as my uncle because my mother had a very good relationship with him. And my mother's mother was alive. My mother's father died when my mother was 10 years old. She had two older brothers. One was 2 years older than my mother, and
were their names?
his name was Aladar. Very, very, very close. They got into all kinds of trouble. My mother used to tell me all kinds of things that they used to do. They used to get into trouble together. And the other brother was 10 years older than my mother, so he was quite old. And
His name was.
Arpad. And
What were your grandparents' names?
my grandparents' names?
Yeah.
You know what? Don't remember. I do have that written down. And wow, I don't know. And so that's my mother's family. And basically, my mother lost her father when she was 10 years old. So my grandmother was sort of a really austere businesswoman. She had to take over. They had a factory. They had a shoe factory. And so she had to take over. So she was the businesswoman. But and she was pretty strict with my mother and her brother, the younger brother. The older brother, of course, was already working. And apparently, he sort of was, my grandmother took over the factory, but he didn't work at the factory at all. He had his own business, but he was very good to my mother and to his brother. And when they grew up, and later on, took them all kinds of holidays. They went on holidays, the ski holidays to Italy, and they went to Monte Carlo. And so those are, but of course I never met him because the older brother, he died during the war. So there's some really funny stories about my mother and her brother, Aladar, because one of the main stories, which sort of shows what my mother, the kind of woman my mother became. I think when she was, I don't know how old, this was before her father died. I don't know, she was about 5 or so. They were fooling around, and he was carrying her or something, and he dropped her onto the concrete, and apparently she broke her leg badly. And, they knew they were going to get into trouble. So he somehow carried her onto a chair and told her to sit there. Now, here she's got a terribly broken leg, a lot of pain, and she sits there for I don't know how long. And then apparently when my grandmother and grandfather came in for lunch or whatever, and she was sitting there and sort of didn't say anything. They didn't think anything of it. And, it didn't become known till later on that evening, and so all kinds of things that happened. And apparently my mother spent a good part of the year in bed. In those days, you didn't go to hospital. I don't know what, and the doctor came all the time and said it or whatever they did, sort of just, and she really, they didn't think that she'd ever be able to walk, and she did. But imagine, a little kid. Today, that would not happen. Things are very, very different. Were different, I think, in Europe and so on. Anyway, that's just a sort of a little anecdote about but my mother was very, very close to both her brothers, but like I said, one was really much older than she was. So when they lost their father, I'm sure it was very difficult, because in those days, my let's see, I think my grandfather was about 40 years old or so he was pretty young, when he passed away. And so in those days, for a woman to take over a factory and run it by herself was pretty amazing.
So this was a shoe factory in Belgrade?
No, Hungary, Budapest. My mother's family's totally from Hungarian. They go back, I don't know how many generations, Hungarian, from Budapest. And so when my mother, I guess she got married very young, in those days, of course, and she had my sister, and I guess decided very, very quickly that she loved Uncle. I called him Uncle Richard. He was like my uncle later on when I was born, because she loved him as a friend, but really not as a husband, so got divorced. And in Hungary, in Budapest, in a big city, people got divorced. It was very different than, I remember when you, in the 50s or 60s even, but in the 50s in Canada, the United States, divorce was terrible and frowned upon. Well, in Hungary, people got divorced. It wasn't such a terrible, terrible big deal as it was, which is interesting in itself. So she was divorced, but they remained very, very, very good friends. And he was very much part of my sister's life, and he got remarried. And
Was he Jewish?
yes, very Jewish, very Jewish. I'll get into that a little bit later, because part of the time when we were all hiding together, and then he didn't, and we did. We made it, and he didn't. But anyway, so that's sort of the background. My mother, I guess, then, after she was divorced, she never, for a long, long time, actually, many years. And she traveled with both her brothers. And like I said, my Uncle Arpad, he had one daughter, so I had this one cousin. And she was a couple years older than my sister. And so they traveled and had a really very nice life. And then I guess my mother met my father at about 37 or so, and they got married 1938. And I guess, I don't know when, they must have moved right away to Belgrade. I unfortunately know almost nothing about my father's family. I had this one picture, and I can't find it. But I remember his, I don't even know their names, nothing. This is terrible. And, but he had he had an aunt, so his mother's sister. And I don't know how, but she wound up being with us later on after the war, and I don't know. So she survived. His whole family really was totally annihilated in Belgrade. And he apparently had studied in Vienna to become a doctor, because his father made him do that. But then his father died at one point during my father's studies, and he stopped because he didn't ever want to be a doctor. Again, in those days, people did what their parents told them to do. You became this and you did that, and that's how it was. Anyhow, so back to Belgrade. So we're in Belgrade, and my sister's walking with me and making some money, and that's how I became Agi. And at some point, so the war broke out, and at some point, not long, I don't know how long, a few months later, my parents had apparently a lovely, people lived in apartments in Europe, of course, and some Nazi Gestapo or Nazi upper crust, so I think they must have been either Gestapo or high up somebody. They came into our apartment and basically told my parents they had to leave. And I don't know how old I was, but I was probably 7, 8 months, somewhere around there, don't know. And my mother was beautiful and very, I guess, very persuasive. And she somehow persuaded these officers to let my father and my mother and me as a baby and my sister to be in the maid's room and live in the maid's room. And my mother would cook and clean for these people. And they did. And I don't know for how long. It must have been horrible, I think. And this is one thing that I am astounded at, frankly, because, I look around my home. We all, and my friends, we're all live in our home. We're comfortable in our home. And to have some strangers come in and take over your home and tell you have 20 minutes or half an hour, whatever, to leave, and then to persuade them that you're going to cook and clean for them in your home, touching your things, to me, that has always been, I don't know how she did it. I don't know if I could have done it. But you never know what you can do or you can't do. That's life, I think, during war and time. And obviously they were scared for their lives. In this way, at least they had a home. At that time, my mother realized this was very dangerous. And they were starting to do things. I don't know if they started with the stars right away. I don't know exactly. But it became obviously clear to my parents that something had to be done. So my mother started going out to different places to see if she could talk some people into helping the family escape to Hungary. Obviously, my mother was in touch with my grandmother, so there was mail going through. And I guess things were better in Budapest. And I don't know, again, when people started disappearing, Jewish people started disappearing, but apparently in Hungary that wasn't quite the case. And at that point, for probably personal reasons as well, this was not a situation that was bearable for the family to get to Budapest and be with my grandmother, where she didn't have to be a servant in her own home and so on. So she tried various things to escape, get out of Belgrade. And apparently there were a couple times when she arranged something and it fell through. And so finally, she was a very, very strong woman, and she decided, okay, that's it. We can't rely on anybody. And we're going to just leave and walk. And there was a baby carriage for me, and I guess very small suitcases, because they start to walk. And that journey, apparently from Belgrade to Budapest, is about 196 miles. It's a long way. I remember my sister telling me a story. Don't forget, she's at that point 13. So she's a teenager, young, really a child. And also in those days, a 13-year-old wasn't the same as a 13-year-old today. Much more treated like a child instead of, now we say young ladies and so on, teenagers. My sister told me a story of there were all these stores that had been just left, and the most important thing was food. So I remember she told me a story about this candy store, and she found a little wagon, and she just put and it was left. The stores had been, they'd been just left by the owners because they were escaping. So there was stuff to take, and she took the candy. But there were stores with other kind of stores, even jewelry stores, and people weren't interested at all in that because it was food. That was the most important thing.
This is on the way?
This is on the way, yeah. And my mother also told me this, that she, more often than not, carried me instead of putting me into the carriage, because she decided if something would happen, a bomb or something would happen, she wanted me to die with her, because she didn't want this baby to be, if she were killed, then what would happen to the baby, and so me. So therefore, she carried me a lot of the time. And that journey apparently was very arduous, and I guess more difficult for my father than my mother, because he had often said, just leave me here, just keep going, because I can't do it anymore. But she wouldn't. And they did have They were able to travel, not travel, but they got some lifts from truck drivers, but not that much. Near the border, they apparently stopped at a little village, which was more like, it was a shtetl. Should I explain what a shtetl is?
No, yeah.
No, okay. So it was basically a shtetl, and so stopped for a few days, and the rabbi and everybody was very welcoming, and come and stay, and we'll take care of you. And you can imagine after walking and being hungry and dirty and so on, how good that felt. But apparently after a few days, my mother really had like an ESP, because she all of a sudden woke up one morning, she said, we have to leave right now. And they did, even though the rabbi said, why are you, stay here, it's lovely here, and it's safe here. It was right near the border of Hungary. And nope, my mother said, no, we have to leave. They did, and apparently a few days later found that whole village had been annihilated. So it's very interesting, this ESP of my mother's. Many times we have feelings like this, and sometimes they come true, sometimes they don't, and they sure did. Anyway, apparently we eventually reached my grandmother, and my parents moved in with her, and they pretended that they were boyfriend and girlfriend instead of being married. And the reason they did that was because at that point, Hungarian Jews were not being deported. Now, nothing else was good for the Jews in Budapest, as Jews everywhere, with the Jewish star, and I think the young men I know had to go to work camps, and I guess my uncle Aladar, that's what my uncle Aladar, he was at a work camp. But my father was Serb. So as a Serbian Jew, he would have been deported. So it was not safe. So they pretend they were just boyfriend and girlfriend, I guess, instead of, I don't know why that made it better. And like I said, I don't remember, in fact, I don't know, I wasn't told how long the period was, how old I was when we arrived. But then a neighbor.
I think this was about 1941?
Well, I think 1942, because I think I was 2 years old when we arrived before that, and then we lived with my grandmother. But then one of the neighbors informed on my father that he was Serb, that he was Serbian, that he should have not been there, masquerading as a Hungarian. And they knew that Serbian Jews were being deported. And so they informed to the Gestapo, and my parents were summoned to the Gestapo. And very hard, I asked my mother why, but they went to the headquarters in Budapest somewhere. And my mother and father ran into an old classmate of my mother's, and in the building, who was not Jewish, obviously, he was working there. And he was astounded that she was there, and why are you here, and she told him, and he said, just run. And this is a little confusing, because my mother did tell me that she did somehow, they were called in front of some people, and she lost her temper and started yelling, the only reason I'm here is I'm Jewish, and you're not. And apparently not the judge, whoever he was, the head guy, whoever, started yelling at her. He was so angry, and get out, instead of actually imprisoning them. And they managed to run away. And my father that night left. That's really my first memory that I ever have. My father, I remember a door and my father leaving and me crying. So he left, he went and escaped into the countryside. And that's...
Tell me some more about that, what you remember?
I just remember standing at the door crying. Now, I was only 2. Most people don't have a memory at the age of 2. And that is a memory that is... I just remember the big front door. Of course, for me, it was a huge front door because I was, 2, so pretty small. And crying, because I knew he was leaving, and that's all I knew. then I really don't have much of a memory. You know, we were living with my grandmother. I imagine that life was pretty difficult. They were Jewish, and they had to wear the Jewish star. I'm sure food was scarce.
Well, let me ask you a little about that, about your family and their Jewish observance. Was your grandmother religious?
No, no.
So
I
you
think
answer
her
that-
parents
you
had
answer
been.
that one in a complete sentence then.
Oh, you're right.
Right.
That's right. No, my grandparents apparently were not religious. In fact, my uncle, Aladar, I don't think even had a bar mitzvah. And I don't know about my uncle Arpad, who was much older. Certainly, my mother's grandparents were religious. So, but they were very assimilated in Budapest. You know, they were big city Jews, very different than the small villages. Because the people in Hungary, as in Poland and many other places, the small villages were like shtetls, where the Jews lived in small villages. They were really all Orthodox. But in Budapest, they were assimilated, basically the way we are here, and so. Some people were religious, but a lot of the Hungarian Jews in Budapest were really not religious. They were more like what we would say conservative or even reformed. Although I don't think that was the official name, but you know. So my mother really did not have a quote religious upbringing, and but obviously being Jewish, it didn't matter whether you were religious or not. You were a Jew, and that was that.
What language did your parents speak to each other?
Hungarian. Hungarian, yeah. My father spoke actually many languages.
That would be an example, I guess, also where you'd say my parents spoke
Oh,
Hungarian to each other.
Right, okay. My parents spoke Hungarian with each other. My father spoke 6 languages, so did my sister eventually. My mother spoke Hungarian. She spoke German. I probably a little bit, I don't know how well, and later on she spoke, of course, very well, because we lived in Austria, but that's later on. My father spoke Serbian, but he spoke Hungarian. He spoke English, I think. No, I don't know if he spoke English. He certainly spoke German. He spoke quite a few languages. But yeah, Hungarian was the language. My mother spoke Serbian because she lived in Belgrade for a few years. I'm sure she had an accent and so on, but she did speak Serbian. So.
But at home you spoke.
At home we
Hungarian.
spoke only Hungarian. I mean that's my mother tongue. That's what it's called, the mother tongue when you're born in Europe. Your first language of choice is Hungarian. I mean, is your mother tongue. That's what it's called.
So no Yiddish?
No, we spoke absolutely no Yiddish at all. No. And again, remember, Jews from Budapest were assimilated. Jews in Berlin, in the big cities, were assimilated. And actually, most Hungarian Jews don't speak Yiddish. Yiddish was, I think, basically mostly for Jews from the shtetls, and they were able to communicate with each other, whether they were Polish or Russian or Hungarian. Yiddish was sort of the universal language of Orthodox religious Jews in small towns, in shtetls. In the big city like Berlin, the Jews of Berlin spoke German, did not speak Yiddish. Yiddish is sort of a bastardized German, and most people who speak German don't want to speak Yiddish, didn't want to speak Yiddish, because it really is a bastardized German. So it's sort of speaking a slang that most people, if you speak German, don't really like Yiddish. I don't know if I'm explaining this properly, but that's basically really true. And Hungarian Jews spoke Hungarian in Budapest.
Did your family, anyone keep kosher?
Nobody in my family kept kosher. Like I said, my uncle didn't even have a bar mitzvah. I think, well, I know my mother's grandparents kept kosher and all that, but somehow my grandmother didn't. Whether she kept kosher before her husband died, I don't know. It's not, it's just something that just wasn't, they weren't very religious at all, or observant, shall I say.
So back to the long walk from Belgrade to Budapest, which is quite an incredible story. Did your mother tell you any more stories about what that was like?
Well, there is, I remember my mother telling me that at one point they were in a truck. And this is a very, very sad, very terrible anecdote, which took place many times, unfortunately, I'm sure. They were in a truck and they were, I don't know, traveling through someplace where they had to all be very quiet. And it was, I guess, a covered truck, you know, and somebody had a baby. And I remember my mother telling me, and I guess this is something that I don't think often about, so I try not to think about it. There was a baby, and the baby was crying, and apparently they had to muffle the baby. And obviously that baby died. But there were about, I don't know how many people in the truck, and I guess it would have been a matter of, I don't know, 30 people being caught. And I know I've read stories, and I know this has happened, and my mother has told me that this happened. But I guess it's something I don't very often think about because it's pretty awful. But that was one of the stories of. And, you know, I do remember my mother saying there were, I don't know if it's gunfire or bombs during that. I mean, it was a pretty arduous walk. I don't know how long it took. But my father, as I said, finally begged her to leave him because he couldn't go on anymore. And my mother was this incredible person who, there's no way, she'd drag them up and we would walk, or they would walk. And I guess got food on the way. I wish I had asked more questions. You know, unfortunately, a lot of people, whether you're a Holocaust survivor, just normally, we don't seem to ask the questions that we should. So
Your mother sounds like an incredible woman.
my mother was a very, very incredible woman. She was extremely strong. And I guess she really, not I guess, she is the reason we have survived. And again, later on in the story, you'll hear just some of the things. It was all my mother. It was really all my mother in terms of determination, in terms of decision making as to what should happen, what shouldn't happen, what's going, you know. Because if it hadn't been for her, just her own strength, even the fact that, you know, as I said, going back to cleaning for these people and taking care, you know, just for survival. So it's really interesting. The survival instinct in some people is much stronger than others. And she was one of these people who, for her family, that was the most important thing, for her children. And to my mother, always her children were the most important thing in the world. And that's, I think, something that probably I've inherited from her too.
What was she like as a mother? Was she strict?
She
was she warm?
Oh, my mother was extremely, extremely warm, which when we get a little further on the story, which is interesting, I've told you about my grandmother who had to take over as a businesswoman and so on. She was very strict and not a very warm person. My mother was the total opposite of that. My uncle Aladar was the total opposite of that. He was funny, always told jokes, warm, loving, and the two of them had this incredible relationship. And my mother was extremely warm and loving to my sister and me. I mean, that's just that. And she was a very gregarious person, loved people. And so she was not only loving to us, but she was loving to everybody all her life. She was always a life of the party. Nothing was ever too much for her. People could come and go, and her house was always open to everybody. That's just the person she was. So she
Sorry, I
was,
forgot her name again.
her name was Esther, and her name was Totis. That was her maiden name, Totisc. So Esther Totis was her maiden name.
And your father's name was?
My father's name was Leopold Herzog. So, and Leopold is and again, my father's, I don't know how back, this has always been very confusing, and I said, I don't know the history, because Leopold is a German name, and I think they were from Austria originally. So I am not sure when they moved and he became Serbian. So I think originally they were from Austria. And so his name was Leopold Herzog. And he, of course, he went to school in Vienna and spoke perfect German and so on. So basically, so we lived with my grandmother during the war. I have a couple of pictures, and we must have had, I have a picture of me and two other little girls on the beach. So we must have been able to have certain freedoms during that time. I don't remember my mother telling me anything about that, and I have no memories at all of that period till really, till I was 4. So, but I do have, like I said, a couple pictures of two little girls and myself on the beach. So we must have had freedoms to do some things like that. But anyway,
So your
basically, my father I never saw. My father, as I said, my last memory of him was at the door, and I really didn't see him again till after the war. He was in hiding in the countryside because he would have been deported immediately. Once they informed the Gestapo that he was there, and he was not Hungarian. There's a whole reason why Hungarian Jews were being not deported, and it was because of the regent in Hungary, who was an ally of the Nazis. But then that stopped, and when the Nazis invaded Hungary, and then they set up a whole different system, and the Hungarian Jews started being deported. And that was in the last 9 months of the war. And then, of course, something had to be done because my mother realized we all had to be hiding or we'd be deported. Because by that time, everybody knew that there were deportations going on. I don't know if they totally knew that people were being killed, but by that time, probably, because that was in the last 9 months of the war. And so my mother, again, she took charge of my grandmother, my sister, and herself and me, and I'm 4 at the time, and my sister's already 16. And I often think the war had a big effect on me. I know a much bigger effect and a different effect on my sister. And unfortunately, my sister was not able to be open like my mother was later on and talk about things. But understandably, when you think of how old she was and when the war broke out, just 12, and the fear of a teenager going through that. So apparently they started hiding, and one of the places that I remember that they were hiding in a hospital, and I remember being in a crib. I guess they pretended they were patients, and that's my last memory of my sister's father, Uncle Roger, because I remember him. Like I said, I loved him. He was my uncle, I thought, and he was hiding with us. I guess it was a group, and then I don't know how long we were there in that hospital hiding. Obviously, couldn't go on for too long, and my mother was trying all different places and things to do to hide. And so she had heard about this priest who was hiding some people, some Jewish women, I guess. And so I remember the hospital, and I remember my Uncle Richard, and apparently after that, some people were caught. We weren't. And my Uncle Richard did wind up being deported and subsequently died in I don't know, Auschwitz or. And so my mother heard about this priest and that he was hiding some women, and she approached him, and he just said, I can't help you. I've got the fill. I can't help you. Well, if you recall, my mother being very strong, and she would not take no for an answer. And I guess she really hounded him, said, you have to help us, please help us. Her family was at stake, and she didn't let go. So finally, he said, well, I'll hide you in my apartment. He was living in an apartment. And I'll hide you in my apartment, and we'll see what we can do. So we were in his apartment for, I don't know, again, a couple of months. And now, he was a priest, but he had an apartment, which I don't know if that's strange or not, because I know a lot of times, but maybe because of the war or whatever, because he wasn't living in a diocese or whatever. He was just in his own apartment. But he was living there alone. So there was my sister, my mother, my grandmother, and myself. And so I remember we only could walk one person at a time because he was living alone. And if neighbors heard, they should only hear one footstep at a time. Well, by that time, there were a lot of air raids and a lot of bombing going on in Hungary, because Hungary really was an enemy of the Allies. So Budapest was being bombed. And what happened is the apartment houses had these big cellars, and they had, the people had organized, all the people in all the apartment buildings had organized the way that the occupants of the apartments, when there was an air raid, everybody had to go to the cellar. And I guess they had a whole system of making sure that, you were there to make sure they were taking care of each other, all the other people in the apartments, to make sure that everybody would be safe. So when there was an air raid, everybody had to go to the cellar, which meant the priest had to go to the cellar. We weren't there. We were non-entities. So we hid in his little bathroom, and sometimes for hours and hours, because air raids took hours and hours, and in the little bathroom with no windows. And I very much remember the bombs, the air raids, the sirens. It took me a long, long time, and even now sometimes when I hear a siren, it doesn't feel good. But the sirens had a very different sound, which later on way after the war, the same sound was actually in Toronto. And it was and that sound scared me. Very different than if you've ever heard the sound in France, which is a very different sound when the police and the ambulances come. So it had a specific sound which left its mark on me for many, many years. Like I said, even sometimes now, though it's a very different sound now, which is good, because that sound terrified me. And it was very scary to be in that bathroom for hours. And I remember my mother made like a bed for my grandmother in the bathtub. And one of the things I remember also about that time is my grandmother took a nap. I don't know how old she was. I have to figure that out, because she was probably younger than I am now, but she had a nap every afternoon, and I remember I had to have a nap with her. I was 4 years old, and you had to have a nap, so I had to have a nap beside her. But she was a very stern lady, very unlike my mother, totally unlike my mother. In fact, my sister didn't really like my grandmother because she really never smiled. She was just not warm at all. How my mother grew out of that to be such a warm, loving person has been an amazing thing to me. Like, she was the total antithesis of my grandmother. And that's probably because of her, being so young and being widowed and taking care of something. Or maybe my mother inherited my grandfather's personality, and she was just a different. And my Uncle Uladar also, very, very warm and loving. So nobody seemed to have that stern personality of my grandmother's. So I don't have any really warm memories of my grandmother, Anyway, we were in that apartment, like I said, I don't know, 6 weeks, 2 months. I remember one time the window shattered because of the bombs. Very, very scary. And
And you were saying you took a nap with your...
I had to take naps when my grandmother she took her nap in the afternoon. She took a nap every afternoon, and I had to have a nap because I was 4 years old, and so I had to have a nap with her. And I did not like that at all, because I guess in those days, 4-year-olds had to take naps. Children do take naps too, still here too, but it's usually, I don't know. That was sort of a memory that I have. I do.
Are you picking up the squeaking on our shoes? Is that
Am I what?
I was asking Taylor.
Are we doing what?
Getting any sound noise? Because sometimes I hear...
Oh, am I doing something?
You know what I was thinking? Maybe what I.
Oh, I don't have to do this.
Is in fact, I can.
You want to put a pillow underneath? What? Oh, I can do.
I just
What are we doing?
put this down, and you can put your feet
Well,
on that.
here, give me the pillow, not your jacket.
Or you can
Well,
take
why
your
not
shoes
a
off.
pillow or shoes off if you're
Yeah,
feel
I don't care.
comfortable.
Well, you're not seeing the shoes anyway, right?
Yeah,
Oh, well,
Maybe like a
fine.
newscaster. I can just... I'm,
That's great.
I can
Thank
hear
you.
Your feet squeaking together.
Yes.
It's very
Oh,
cute.
really? My nose is itchy.
Occasionally there's
Yeah, I was
some-
gonna say, if I have, my nose is itchy.
Okay, do you want a glass of water or anything?
No, I'm fine, my nose is itchy. Yeah, okay. Is it okay?
You feeling okay?
Yeah, I'm fine.
Yeah?
Is this coming through? What does it sound like?
yes, it's perfect.
It's great.
Ah.
Yeah.
You're doing really well. I love all the little stories and just the memories and what
They
your
just
mother
sort of,
told you.
they jump in at you, you know?
That's what we
Yeah,
want to get.
okay,
It's
I
about
should put my
stories,
feet, maybe, you know what, here.
Would you like a pillow?
Yeah, maybe then I don't have to, yeah,
It's chilly. Oh, there you go.
okay.
Would you like a little blanket on top?
I'm not
Sure.
cold.
Okay.
Are you cold?
Yeah, Borvis or Barfus or whatever they say in Hungary.
Oh, what?
In Hungary, Barfus or Barfus is German.
Oh, that's German.
And Yiddish would be Borvis, but since
Yeah, I don't,
I'm
you know,
not
again,
German,
I'm one of those people that speaks German and can't stand Yiddish. I mean, you know, I understand it except when they put in the Polish and Russian and Hebrew words, but of course I understand Yiddish. But it sounds terrible to my ears.
Switch to the left or, okay.
Do you speak Yiddish?
No, I don't. I speak Russian.
Oh, do you?
Yeah.
Yiddish to me sounds terrible.
Yeah.
And you can imagine, I mean, people in Berlin did not speak Yiddish. It's a travesty, really. I mean, when you speak a language and you speak High German, which is what it's called, it's just, yeah, because the pronunciation is so awful.
But it's its own, anyways.
What?
another conversation.
No.
It's a Jewish language, so it's.
It's
our own.
No, right. But you know what? You're right, except it was done in the shtetls, and it was not spoken in the cities.
With a mix with Hebrew and
It's
an
mixed,
invention.
right,
We're almost
exactly.
off track. I just listened to this podcast this weekend about Yiddish in Israel, and the Israelis didn't like it when people they discouraged speaking Yiddish.
Did they?
Ben Yehuda, who invented the Hebrew alphabet, the modern Hebrew, he said he'd speak any language but Yiddish because Yiddish was the language of exile, and Israelis kind of almost wanted to not stamp it out, but it was in the same way they wanted to move on. You know?
Right.
Well, you
It's,
need a united country
Yeah.
on one language. with
but
people
it was almost like, and you know what? It's like being, looking down. In a way, looking down of the, people did look down on unfortunately, on say the shtetls, or because that was sort of the peasantry, and right or wrong, that's just city, and I guess that's sort of suburban versus today too.
So
The
we're
peasantry?
Yes.
All right. Where
All
was
right.
I?
So we're with the,
I don't know where I was.
priest's apartment.
Oh, so
Tell
all
me
right.
about the priest and what was his name? And what
His
he
name
done.
was Kalman.
The priest's name was.
His name was
So we
Kalman.
would start that one with the priest's name was.
Pardon?
Repeat the question so it's like
Oh,
the
okay.
priest's name.
So the priest's name was Kalman, and obviously, my mother was very grateful to him. And he, in the meantime, was looking for a permanent place for us to hide, because we couldn't be in his apartment forever. And as I said, it was pretty hard on me. I remember I was only allowed, or one person at a time could walk. So imagine I'm 4 years old, I can't run or play really, and I have to walk very carefully, and only one person at a time, and being very quiet because I was a child. And of course, there should be no child's voice heard or laughter heard. And the one thing is, number one, I was European. So in Europe, children were brought up very differently than we bring up our children today, than the way maybe I've brought up, although I'm pretty strict. I was pretty strict. And, but we were brought up very strictly. Basically, when my mother told me to do something, I did it. But there are a couple of incidences where I guess I didn't. I will talk about that in a little bit, because it was a little bit afterward, the war. But anyhow, basically you did what you were told. You did exactly what you were told, when you were told, and how to do things. And when I was told one step at a time, that was it. So eventually, the priest found my mother and my sister and my grandmother, a convent where there were about 40 other Jewish women. They were dressed as nuns. My sister, who was 17 at the time, or 16 at the time, was dressed like a novitiate, which is a nun in learning how to be a nun. But there was this 4-year-old me, and they couldn't put me in the convent because there were no children in the convent. I know there were convents later on. I've read there were convents that had schools attached to them, and so some Jewish children were hidden in these schools, but this convent did not. So the priest found a couple, and I always said family, but they're really a young couple because they had no children, and who said they would take me in. They would hide me. And so I was taken to this couple, and there wasn't much explanation as to why, and you'll be fine. This is what you had to do. And children of war, and besides children in Europe at that time, you didn't ask why or I don't want to. You just did what you were told. And I was told that I would be living with this couple. My name would be changed to, I don't remember what it was, and that I was to pretend that I was a cousin from outside, from the countryside. And I was to live with them because I couldn't live with my mother and my grandmother, my sister, because they had to go someplace else. And that's all I was told. You know, I am sure, I remember the one couple, they had a rocking horse. I was very glad for that because it's something for me to play with. But I'm not sure how I felt. I must have been scared. But I just did what my mother told me to do, and I had to do it. And I don't remember whether I was happy with them, but I don't remember being unhappy either. I'm being unhappy being separated from my mother. Yes, that was terrible for me. However, they treated me well, so I guess I was very lucky, and I was just living with these strangers, basically. And so there was a routine established, and here was the routine. There were the air raids, there were the bombings that occurred, and it was the same routine here as was with the priest. You had to go to the cellars when there were air raids and bombings. And so they told me I should, when people talk to me, I have to say what my name is, and which was a different name, and that I'm their cousin from the countryside. And they really had to trust this 4-year-old. And to me, I think that's one of the very unusual things, because when we think of a 4-year-old and we tell them it's a secret, the first thing a child at 4 says is blurt out the secret. But again, children of war are very different. What I was told to do, I did. But that these people had to trust me, and their lives were in their hands, and of course as an adult, didn't realize it at the time, but since well, as I've grown up, and I realized what these people did, which was amazing, because they took their lives into their hands by hiding this child. Because if this child had blurted out what we consider normal, and to tell that I wasn't related to them, they were nothing, they would have been taken away.
Do you remember their names?
But I had no recollection of them whatsoever in terms of names, nothing. Just that they didn't have children. So they were, I think, a fairly young couple. And what I remember is going a lot of times to the, to the cellars during the air raids. And then one day, they said, we're leaving Budapest, we're going to the country. And they took me to the train station. And I remember standing at the train station, absolutely terrified that I would never, never see my mother again. They were taking me away. They were taking me to the country with them, and I'd never see my mother again. I was terrified. But again, I didn't cry. I didn't show, I was just terrified inside. But I was very well behaved, very well brought up, and you didn't, again, as I said, children did not question adults of why and how come, which, as we all know, is so prevalent today. Kids, why, how come is the first thing and we explain to children today. In those days, nothing was explained to a child. And all of a sudden, I see my mother and Kalman, the priest, come towards me. We're at the train station. I'm terrified, and there they come towards me, coming to get me. Well, you can imagine, I was delighted isn't the word. I felt so happy, and because I had been terrified. But unfortunately, I couldn't stay with my mother, and again, probably without much explanation, I was taken to another couple and said, this is where you're going to live now. So here I was being transferred, and I don't remember how long I'd been with this one couple, and that this took place. And again, a different name and the same routine. And but at least I knew that I wasn't taken away. And one of the things that this left me with, this being terrified, is when I was much, much older, probably in my 40s, and my mother and I were talking about this incident, because we talked about the war every now and then, and my mother was wonderful in terms of my children, telling them, sitting them down, having story time of the war, and they loved listening to it. And I said something to my mother about how terrified I'd been, that time. And my mother looked at me and said, oh yes, there was never a question. We knew that they were moving to the countryside, and we were coming to get you. The only difference is that nobody bothered telling the 4-year-old. And I remember, I think that was one of the few times in my life that I was so angry with my mother, I didn't know what to do with myself. Because this is not something that we do today, and we're so aware psychologically of how you affect children and what happens. But in those days, people didn't think psychologically affecting children or what it meant. That all they would have had to do is tell me that it was okay, they weren't taking me away, but they didn't. So I remember that was an incident that I was like I said, in my 40s, I'm very angry with my mother for having I was feeling sorry for that little girl, having put that little girl through such horror. But anyway, back to, so I was with another couple in the same routine. And then there was an incident. European apartment buildings often have a courtyard. They surround a courtyard. And there were some German soldiers that were stationed. They were there. I don't know what they were doing there. They were camping out there. And we had an air raid. And for some reason, and this is with the second couple, I think it was with, yeah. And they sent me to said, this, go ahead, go to the cellar, and they'll be following me. And for whatever reason, this was very strange. So remember, they had always, again, the same thing, don't talk to people when they ask you questions, because you can imagine, they were terrified of me saying something and, letting on that they're hiding me. But people did talk to me, but I guess I talked to them and answered, but certainly never revealed anything. And when I was walking through the courtyard, these soldiers who were German, who had been separated as soldiers are from their own children, and they were so happy to see a child and started talking to me. And I was told never to talk to them, and that somehow they were bad people. They did, and everybody, they were bad people. I didn't know why, and so I sort of knew that they were bad people, and that's all I knew. And so I'm standing at the head of the stairs, and for whatever reason, I was the first one there. Nobody was there in the cellar yet. And there was a big, thick candle that was lighting the stairs, down the stairs, because those cellars were pretty deep. And for some reason, again, these European apartments, why they had cellars is a very interesting question, but they were deep cellars, and that's where the people hid. And they were built that way, which I find interesting when I think about now. Why were they built there? And that's where people hid from the apartments. And a bomb hit in that courtyard, and there was a huge noise and a huge wind, and I was sort of thrown. The wind threw me down the cellar stairs. I guess I wasn't hurt very much, and then all of a sudden people came, but that is a huge traumatic incident that I remember. And the other thing that I remember is I guess a lot of the soldiers were killed. And this is very sad. Here I am, a 4-year-old child, and I remember thinking, oh, these were bad people, and it was a good thing that they died. That's a very sad thing for a 4-year-old to think about. And but that was I remember that. Anyhow, the rest of the time, that's sort of a blur. Obviously we had a lot of air raids. Like I said, every time that siren went off, it left an indelible mark on me. And so then eventually the war was over.
Did you have enough food to eat?
We had, I don't remember ever being hungry. So we must have had certainly enough food. Obviously, there wasn't that much food because the first couple went to the countryside because of lack of food. So obviously, there wasn't a lot of food, but whatever it was, I don't remember ever being really hungry, which is sort of strange and interesting. Must have been enough, whatever it was. I'm sure there wasn't a big array of food, and certainly we know from facts that it was very difficult. But I think that I did see, well, maybe I remember seeing my mother a couple of times, but I'm not sure if this was I think it must have been right after the war was over, not before, because after the war, and I don't know where we lived, if we lived in my grandmother's apartment, which was interesting. That is something I wish I would have asked my mother, if that was empty, because during the 9 months that we were hiding, whether somebody occupied that apartment, but I think we were back in that apartment again after the war. What I do remember is the Russian army marching through, and they were the conquering army, marching through the city streets. I remember standing with the people that were taking care of me, and I remember I was very excited because I knew that I was going to see my mother again. And the air raids were stopping. I guess they told me that. And they told me that I was going to see my mother again. But what I do remember is the feeling, and I very distinctly knew that the people all around me, as we're standing in the streets watching the the Russian army marched through the big streets and people lined up. And all I, of course, saw were their steps, their feet, because I was very little. But I remember the feeling of people being unhappy. And I was happy. And I was wondering why the people were very unhappy. Of course, they were unhappy because they knew that the Russians were communists and they were taking over the country. And they were the conquering army. And what was going to happen to them, because the Hungarians had been enemies of the Russians. And at the beginning of the war, before, had invaded the Russians. So they were enemies. So they knew they were not going to be taken over benevolently. And but the feeling was very pervasive, and I was very much aware of it. And the only thing I do remember is that I was happy, but they weren't. And eventually, we were all together again. And again, I do remember my mother and I, one time, it was very cold, and the Danube, which runs through Budapest, the river, was frozen, and there were, after the war, the Allies, probably American airplanes, were dropping candy and gum. And I remember one of the things my mother made us do when they do fly over was to lie flat on the Danube. And I don't know if that was fear of just natural fear from the air raids, because they weren't going to bomb us. They were dropping candy. So that's just the memory that I have. And so.
Did you understand why you weren't hiding at all? Or?
I did not understand. No, I didn't. I did not understand why we were hiding at all during the hiding. I was just told that this is what was happening, but I knew nothing about the reason that I was told to have a different name, that I was told that I was this cousin. In terms of any kind of religious identity, that just was absolutely not in my purview at all. And remember like I said, children of war just did what they were told. And that's true today. Children of war do what they're told. I don't think children of war, they don't question. I think it's a natural thing when adults are in danger and they have children, and you are brought up from the time that you can remember that when you're told to be quiet, that's, danger. You are aware of danger. And just like being in the priest's apartment, I was told to be quiet because it was dangerous. And therefore, you're quiet. And I think, I do think that's sort of I've made a generalization, but just what I've read. And I think today, when you see people children of war, a child does what they're told. They're very aware there's danger. Maybe they don't know exactly what that means in terms of what are the consequences if they do talk. I don't know at what age that would come really to light. But first is the obedience, because your parent tells you to be quiet and something's going to happen. And that's just, I had no clue of why I was separated from my mother. I was just, that was the way it was, and that there was no questioning. Like I said, I didn't question at all of why. And I do think that is a generalization that I've made, and I think from what I've read. Again, European upbringing anyway. You didn't say why. If your parent told you to do this, then you did it.
Are you getting my shoulder
So,
in the frame a little bit? Or?
No, just when you lean over, but keep right where you are. 'Cause
are you in the way? Gee,
I'm always
are you sort of a nobody? Do you get the feeling you're a nobody? You're a ghost? So my father and mother, obviously, somehow, after we lived together again, and I don't know exactly how long, my father got in touch with my mother. Somehow they were able to communicate with each other. And there was food in the country. And then in Hungary, right after the war, there was no food, And so my mother decided, or my mother and father decided, that my sister and I would go to the countryside and be with my father. And so she sent us, obviously, on our way. It was very cold, must have been like somewhere in November, cold. And I'm wearing a sheepskin jacket because in Hungary, people wear sheepskin jackets because that's a whole, the sheepskin country, and that whole countryside is like, it's actually from Hungary. And anyway, we were crossing, and I don't know, I've been trying to find out if it's a river or a lake, huge, that we were crossing to the other side. It was winter time, so we're wearing sheepskin jackets and boots or whatever. We're on a cattle barge. We're all standing, and apparently a couple hundred people are standing on this barge crossing, and it's nighttime. It was nighttime, and suddenly I remember we're having to go to the left, go to the right, go to the left. Well, apparently they'd overcrowded the cattle barge, and they were trying to rectify, to make sure it wasn't going to go over, and so they were telling us to go to the left, to the right. Anyway, it didn't help. It capsized, and we all wound up in the water. And my sister was a fantastic swimmer. I, of course, couldn't swim because during the war, nobody had taught me to swim. There was no opportunity. So my sister, I remember, is carrying me in her left arm, and she's got this big bag, rucksack, whatever, with our clothes. And she was a phenomenal swimmer, apparently, and swimming. And then somebody grabs my head, and it was a woman, an elderly woman, I guess, and she dragged me underneath. She dragged my face under the water. And I was terrified. Obviously, I nearly drowned. And my sister had to let go of the clothes, and she had to kick her away. And she swam to the other side. There were a lot of people that drowned. Obviously, that lady did too. And that caused a great fear of water for me for a number of years. But we got to the other side. It must have been pretty cold and pretty awful. For me, I just remember the horrible incident of being dragged under and not being able to breathe. And some farmers took in all the people that were rescued.
So this was just you and your
And
sister?
it was my sister and me. My mother had sent us because there was food where my father was. My sister stayed behind, I guess, probably to take care of my grandmother. So
Your mother stayed behind.
my mother stayed behind with my grandmother, and she was sending my sister and me to my father because he had told her there was food in the countryside. And so we were with these farmers, really, who took us in, and they clothed us, and obviously we lost everything, all the clothing and stuff. And we were there a few days, and I know that for my mother that was horrible because, of course, there was no communication for her to know that we were okay. They heard in Budapest about this terrible accident nearby, and she didn't know whether we had survived or not. And eventually, again, I don't know how word got across. Very different than our communication today with the cell phones and knowing exactly where you are every second of the minute of the day. Even phones weren't available then after the war. And we eventually made it to where my father was. And it was interesting. There was food, and he was with the Russian soldiers. I don't quite understand, or never have the reason, or it was very comfortable, and that's why he had sent for us. And he had made friends with them, and they were delighted. Again, Russian soldiers of war. They haven't seen children. So what I do remember is they played with me. I learned some Russian words. I sat on their laps, had a great time. My father was very, very, you can imagine, my sister was 17 years old. Very different. He's probably protecting her. He was her stepfather, but protecting her like a hen would protect her young, because soldiers, you can imagine, a 17-year-old. But he was very protective of her, and everything was okay. But I do remember that. I don't know how long we were there, but I remember, like I said, having a good time there. And then it was time for my father. I don't know if they helped him escape to, they must have, I think, helped him escape to Austria.
Who helped him?
My father, the Russian soldiers, because he sent us back to my mother, to Budapest, and he somehow escaped to Austria. And he wound up in Vienna, where he established himself and started a business. In the meantime, we were back with my mother and my grandmother in Budapest. And our life there, I guess, was okay. I mean, okay in terms of the communists are taking over the government, but slowly. So it was, I think, difficult for people, but I think there was more food to be had, and there was a life. My father and mother communicated a great deal, and my father was trying to get us out of Hungary legally. And he was trying all kinds of ways to do that. And so if you, one of the things that I said to you earlier is, a child, European upbringing, you sort of do what your elders tell you, etc. But I do remember my mother was having some portraits taken of us, of my sister, my mother, and I think. And in those days, you went to a photographer and you had official portraits taken. And I guess I somehow didn't want to go. And I somehow found a pair of scissors and cut my hair. And so I have a picture of me and my mother and my sister, and I'm looking very sad because obviously I'd gotten a spanking before we took those pictures. So I guess I was, in some ways, I did a couple of rebellious things. But anyhow, so my mother and father were in communication with each other. He was trying to get us out. And I'm not sure, but we were probably living there for about a year and a half. I'm not sure. Sure, because I was at least 6.5, and apparently he was not having much luck. The communists were just closing in the borders, not letting the Hungarians leave. And shall we stop that?
Let's stop and let it ring.
Well, I guess, yeah. Well, maybe if I'll click it and.
That's
Here.
okay, it'll just ring.
Well, no, it rings 20,000
I
times.
can turn it off up here.
Oh, well, now, what did we do here?
You took the battery out there, so
Oh,
nothing's gonna
so now I
happen.
can't stop it. Maybe we should put the battery back in? You think?
It's
Oh, it's good
okay.
to stand up
It's
anyway.
good to stand up anyway, My legs are starting to.
My legs are, too.
Yeah, it's good. We can always
Well,
take
let's
a-
put
we
this
can take a
back in
break.
and then, this way?
Mhm.
Yeah.
You'd use.
And then that way I can stop it better. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and if you wanna grab a glass of water or take a break. in the
Would you like
bathroom.
some?
I'm good, I'm not talking nonstop.
We're back to, I turned it off up there, so we can
What'd you do?
just pull the battery out of the
Oh,
phone.
he pulls, okay, then
So,
pull the battery out
And then,
again.
and then I'll put them both back when I,
Maybe I'll have a little glass of wine.
okay.
Yeah, good idea.
Aren't you bored yet?
Not at all.
Come on.
You're doing
Nobody
so
wants
well.
anything
It's,
to go to water? No?
I love hearing all your stories and your memories. It's great.
You got that little blurb by what do you call it, right?
Well, I just made some little notes on there just to make sure we hear.
I mean, is this what you want to hear?
Yes, this is exactly.
All right. Oh. Okay. Yeah, it felt good to stand up. All right. Now, where the heck were we? Where were we?
We're still in Budapest.
We need the photographer to tell.
You're back at you think you're back at your grandmother's apartment.
Oh, I am back. Oh, yeah, we're back. We're living together. And my father was trying everything to get us out legally. And finally, my mother decided things were getting too difficult. the government was being just taken over, more and more communists, more and more curtailing, I'm not sure, I guess curtailing activity, curtailing freedom, communist country. It became communist more and more. And even though at first the government was letting the Hungarians run things, and then more and more took over. And so she finally decided she couldn't wait anymore for the legal way to get us to leave. And so she started making arrangements, I guess on the black market, however, well, that's the way to do it, or that's how it was done, to escape from Austria. Excuse me, strike that, to escape. And obviously that the arrangements that she made and so on were, we didn't have to walk. There was a truck that took us to the border, and there, let's see, apparently, so the border where we were going to make the escape, on the border of Austria and Hungary, there's this lake, and we were going to be crossing the lake, apparently. Now, one of the only memory I have of the actual walking to the, at one point, we were in a truck, but at one point we had to walk, and we were walking through a grape vines, and I remember picking grapes. That's what I remember, and being very quiet. And there were a whole bunch of people with us too. It wasn't just my mother, my sister, and I. My uncle Aladar, my mother's brother, and my grandmother were not coming. My grandmother decided she was going to stay in Hungary, and my uncle said he would just stay with her. And so I remember walking through the grape arbor and picking grapes. And then we went and we got to this lake, which is Lake Neusiedl, and a huge, huge, huge rowboat. And somehow my mother had taken my favorite quilt and put it on the bottom of this rowboat for me. And I remember being very excited because there was my quilt that I still have to this day. And a down feather quilt. And this was a huge, huge rowboat. There were a whole bunch of people that are strangers to us. And we were told, it was nighttime. I was told not to utter a word, to be totally quiet. I knew at that time that if we were to be caught, we would be shot. So at the age of 6, that was pretty scary. And again, I was told to be quiet. That's what I was. It was a very, very big rowboat, and we spent, I guess, most of the night going in and out of can't believe I lost the word. I always use it. It's in and out of the marshes, I guess, because we couldn't go just across the lake because we would have been shot. And that is my memory of that time. And somehow we got to the other side. Of course, it was all arranged. And whoever met us there took us to a deportation camp, a DP camp. And the DP camp that we were taken to was called it was in Bad Gastein and Hofgastein. Hofgastein is a ski resort, and it's a very well-known ski resort in Austria, and people go there all the time. In fact, my brother-in-law in subsequent years had gone there lots of times, you know. So there were about 1,500 people at that DP camp, and they housed us really in about 5 huge resort hotels, and that's where we were housed. So I guess it couldn't have been that terrible. And I remember the smell of cabbage soup for some reason, and running up and down stairs. And again, not that was, I mean, there was food, there's plentiful food, but you know, in those days, there wasn't much like candy and that kind of thing. And so what I remember is I guess my mother taking condensed milk, and you boiled it for 4 hours, and then you got caramel out of it. And I don't know if it just, and subsequently, every few years I do that. I make it because it reminds me, and it's basically a dulce de leche, which in South America, that's what that is. And that was one of the ways to have sweets. So there was a huge tent for gathering for the people to gather, and so I was about, by that time, six and a half, almost 7, and so one time there was a big gathering of the adults, and the children were told they cannot come in to the gathering. Well, the reason was apparently they were showing some films. Now, I was only 6, I was a little young child, and there were some older kids, of course, and they said, come on, we're going to sneak in. They're not letting us come in, so let's sneak in and see what it is. That was probably, and of course, I mean, I was told, I did what I was told, and all the kids went, and I went, and we snuck in, and I guess the adults didn't realize what we had done. Well, it was unfortunately not a great thing to have done, because they were showing movies, and the movies were showing the some of the atrocities that had been done to the Jews. They were showing, I remember when there was like a pile of Jewish dead naked bodies. So that was a horrible thing, which I never should have witnessed, but like I said, we snuck in, and did what I was told to do. So that is a memory that was not great. But anyway, that's when I first started school. Had never been to school. And one of the things I also remember at that time is paper was very scarce. And so I remember sitting with paper and making little squares of drawings, because you couldn't waste paper. When I think now of how much paper I waste, I do something and it goes in the trash and so on, and we all do. And it's really bad, because there I was taking it, it was like gold, making little squares and drawing in those little squares and filling, that whole piece of paper. So we do how important certain things become to you that you're not aware of. Anyway, I started school, and of course I had to learn German. I didn't know German. I couldn't speak German, so started to speak German. I obviously learned it very quickly, and I guess I remember coming home one day, and I was very, very excited, and I actually have this report card, and it tells you, all the subjects, and one of the subjects that says behavior. That was a subject they gave you a grade in. And it wasn't a grade, it was like good, very good. And my first report card, the behavior said only good, not very good. Why? Well, I remember coming home to my mother being very, very excited, because I was put on the last bench of the classroom, and I was very excited. I thought it was a big honor. Of course, I didn't realize it was not a big honor. I was put there because I talked too much, but I didn't know that. And so I only got a good, not a very good. I guess I became very good towards the second semester, because then I guess I learned you don't talk when you're in class. But I was 7 years old when I first went to school.
Was it mostly
We did see
Jews
my
in this
father.
DP camp? Was it Jewish people mostly in this DP?
They were all Jewish people.
All Jews.
Deported persons camp. That's what DP camp is.
Displaced.
Displaced. Thank you. All right, we'll strike that one. Displaced persons camp. Yes, they were all Jews. But I know that now. I did not know anything. I did not know what Jewish, I don't even know that I heard the word. I had no idea what Jewish meant. All right, so we were all people in displaced persons camp. That's all I knew. I never I never even heard that word. So that may sound strange, but that's just the way it was. We visited.
You saw these films about the Holocaust.
Well, that was terrible, but I wasn't allowed. I couldn't ask anybody about it because we weren't allowed to be there, right? So I didn't understand. I just remember seeing this terrible naked bodies on top of each other, and somehow something about gold fillings or something being pulled. That's what I remember. But I do not know, I did not at that time know what that meant. I just knew that it was a horrible thing. Nobody bothered explaining that to me, and I don't know that I asked, or maybe I didn't. Certainly couldn't ask my mother or my sister, right? Because I wasn't supposed to be there. And I don't know that I asked, and I wasn't told. I don't know. It was a pretty gruesome thing. And I don't know, maybe I never even wanted to talk about it. These are things that I cannot even answer or think about because that's my memory. But I did not understand. I guess I understood that we were living there for a reason. Again, maybe that's why later on in my life, I asked about why all the time, but I certainly didn't ask when I was a child. Of why we were living there.
Your sister's father, who you called your uncle.
I knew that my Uncle Resher had died. I knew that. And his wife was alive. Because what I do remember too is my Uncle Resher's wife, Aunt Vera. My sister's name was, by the way, Veronica. We called her Ronnie, but her name was Veronica. And my Aunt Vera had been married to my sister's father. And if you recall, as I said, my mother was good friends with them. And she was like my aunt, and I remember visiting her a great deal and playing. She had these little armchair bands that was fashionable in Europe over armchairs, and they were some little containers with toys. It's hard to describe. That was one of the things. But my mother kept up a relationship with my Aunt Vera, and even much, much later when my mother visited Hungary, because she lived to be a good old age. And my mother, I remember when I went back to Hungary with my mother for in 1975, we went to visit my Aunt Vera, and my mother always sent her money. So there was that kind of relationship. So anyway, I remember we did visit my father, but not that often. So I knew my father, but I really had not spent very much time with him. He lived in Vienna. We lived in the DP camp. And then my sister, by that time, she married an American GI. And my sister and my mother and Jimmy, my brother-in-law, and I, we lived in Salzburg. We moved to Salzburg after we left the DP camp. And I went to school there. And I had
What year was that?
in Salzburg in 1940, 1947. I think it was 1947 that we moved to Salzburg. Sometime in 1947. I don't know how long we were in the DP camp. And my nephew was born in 1949. I remember I became an aunt at the age of 9. I was very excited. I remember walking him, in the carriage, etc. And went to school in Salzburg. And I remember attending some wonderful plays, and there's a very famous festival in Salzburg every summer, and I remember attending that, which was a phenomenal experience. And by that time, of course, I was 8.5 or so. And then I was going to school, and that's when I remember my great aunt, my father's aunt, and she lived with us. She also lived with us in Budapest after the war. So somehow, and I don't know how, she escaped Belgrade. My father's family was all annihilated, but she survived. And one of my memories of her, and I loved her, and she did escape with us to Austria. So she did stay, she was with us. And I loved her. Did not love my grandmother, if you recall. She was just a cold lady. I loved this great aunt. And one of my memories in Hungary during the time that we were living, during the, in between, after the war and in between, before we escaped, was my grandmother and I. We would go to the park every day. She was sort of taking care of me. We went to the park every day, and then I got whooping cough. And then we went up because we lived in Buda. Budapest is divided, Buda and Pest. Pest is sort of the downtown. Buda is more hilly. It's on the other side of the Danube, and it's hilly and more residential. And we'd walk up this little mountain hill because I had whooping cough. And I remember I collected snails and had them walk across the windowsill, and that was one of my playthings. And my great aunt took me. Every day I was with her, and she also moved with us, and she lived with us in Salzburg. In fact, and I had my tonsils out, and I remember her being there with us. And she must have passed away then. Again, I don't remember. It's very sad that one doesn't remember certain things, but I do remember her very well.
And her name was?
And I don't know. I called her Tantika, which means auntie. And I don't know that I just called her Tantika, which is a diminutive word of the word Tante, aunt, in German, like Tantika. Like I was Agika. It's sort of in Hungarian, you put those little syllables on the end of words to make it endearing. Anyhow, so during that time in Salzburg, now again, the word Jewish never came up. My mother, I guess, was very scared for me, for herself, I'm sure, and she decided that I would go to school, and I also would have catechism. So catechism is being taught Roman Catholic religion, and I was taught Roman Catholic religion and was in catechism, and I actually had a communion, which is at the age of 8 about, a Roman Catholic girl and boy, and a girl dresses in all white, and it's a very big ceremony with fancy decorated candle, and you have a catechism where you actually go through confession. That's what Catholics do, and then they have they're given the host. So I had that, and I even have pictures of me dressed like a little bride. That's what they did, and so obviously I thought I was Catholic. And remember, I have never heard the word Jew in my life. Which is, when you think about it, my father, apparently right after the war, my mother told me that not that he had been ever really religious, but he started laying tefillin after the war every morning for a number of months, or maybe a year or two, I don't know. So for him, that's what he did. My mother totally didn't want her daughter, or me, to be Jewish at all, fear of what it had done and what it had meant to our family. Anyway, so that's what I remember about Salzburg. And then
Why do you think your mother and your grandmother had you going to...
My grandmother was not there. My grandmother was in Hungary. My grandmother was in Hungary.
Okay.
And my mother, I believe my mother did that. I did ask her sometimes. I believe it was just fear of being Jewish, fear of anti-Semitism, fear of what had happened to the Jews, of not trusting, and could this happen again, and protecting her child from being Jewish and being what that meant, what it meant to be Jewish and what could have meant to be Jewish. My mother was very brave, but she was protecting her child. I think that's the reason she did that.
Did you ever feel
She was protecting me.
Did you ever feel different? I mean, I understand you didn't know that you were Jewish and you weren't really aware of what that meant. But did you ever feel that you were different?
I don't think I felt anything in terms of, my sister had married a non-Jewish man, and religion was never my mother was not religious, my family wasn't religious, and so suddenly I became religious, Roman Catholic religious. My mother had me become religious, but there was no religion in the house in any way, shape, or form. And so I felt that was just what I was. I guess I felt I was Roman Catholic. That was natural, because that's what I'd been schooled, that I was being schooled as a Roman Catholic child with the Roman Catholic religion, with catechism, and the rest of the family didn't have any religion. And so that's just the way things were, very natural, normal. I saw my father every now and then. We would go to Vienna, but really my parents were separated. I didn't really realize until I became an adult that my parents really hadn't been married that long. Until I really started doing some research into before giving my talk to the classrooms that I now do, I didn't realize when they got married. And in a way, then I was able to understand that really my parents hadn't really had a life together, much of a life. I believe they got married in 1938. I found in the archives of some of the papers that I have. So they got married in 1938. And then they moved maybe in 1939 right away to Belgrade. And then I was born, and then war broke out. And then really, they didn't live together very long, and under not the best of circumstances with the war. And then they were separated, and then when he was in Vienna and we moved to Salzburg, so they really didn't have a relationship together, and certainly not for long. So they did not really have anything. So we visited. As a matter of fact, I do have one memory that I haven't talked about when we were back in, when we were back in Bad Gastein. Remember I told you Bad Gastein, Hofgastein, they're twin towns. Resorts, really, resort town. And I got sick, and I wound up to have scarlet fever. And scarlet fever in those days was a very, very bad thing because it was very highly contagious. And they had special hospitals that were, what would you call them, for infectious diseases or whatever. So I remember my mother taking me to the hospital, and my mother and I spent 6 weeks in one room together in the hospital, because once you're admitted, you were so highly contagious, you couldn't leave, and neither could my mother, because she had to be. So we were together. When I often think of my poor mother, here she was with a 7-year-old for 6 weeks in one room. But I do remember my father came to visit towards the end of that 6 weeks. He was not allowed inside the hospital, but by that time, like maybe it was 4 or 5 weeks, and I guess I wasn't, or she was able to come out of that, and she was able to meet him down in the garden or something. But that's just another memory I have of that time, which is interesting. When my daughter, when she was, I don't know how old she was, 6, 7, she wound up to had scarlet fever. And I diagnosed it, which was funny because I guess for memory, sure enough, it was so different. She was home for a week, she had antibiotics, and it was nothing. But in my day, there was no medication for that. It was just being in this isolation hospital. So that is just one of the memories I have of that time. Anyway, back to Salzburg. So my brother-in-law was an American GI. He was from Texas, and he was being transferred back to the United States, to Texas. And so my sister and my nephew and he were making plans, and so my mother thought, okay, that's where we're going. We're all going to America. And I guess that's when she found out that she was not able to go, quote, to the United States. Now, in those days, at that time, in 1949, Europeans thought America was more or less, they didn't really understand United States, Canada, it was America. Streets were lined with gold, everything was possible. And then she found out she wasn't able to follow my sister to Texas. She was going to some place called Canada through a Jewish organization. And it was, Matt, you've got to stop for a minute, ERO, some refugee organization. I've got it in my notes. What's the first one? Do you know the name of it? I don't know the I, what it stands for. I should have checked it this morning. IRO. It was a Jewish organization, refugee organization, the RO, and the first one, I guess we won't worry about that. I do have the name, but it...
Could be international.
No, I have the name in my notes, if you want me to check. Okay. Isn't that stupid? I keep forgetting it. Anyway, so she was able to go to Canada through the help of this IRO organization that took care of Jewish refugees. And, but she was able to go, but I couldn't. Why? Because the only way that they would take refugees to come to Canada were if individual families vouched and took care in some way of these refugees, so they wouldn't be a burden on the country. So my mother wound up, had to go as a housekeeper for a Jewish family in Toronto, Ontario. Here's a woman who had maids herself. She was with a wonderful family. Their name was TRACA, Trachter, and they... What?
Let your phone ring for a little bit.
Well, it's just a cell phone downstairs. It's okay.
Oh, see, I can't hear it. I'm not working on hearing it.
Was it the Industrial Removal Office?
The what?
Industrial Removal Office?
What? No.
IRO?
No, refugee organization. The I is what I can't.
Okay.
I can look it up in 2 seconds. You want me to look it up? You don't want me to look it up? I want to say it. Ugh.
How the Industrial Removal Office
No.
contributes to America's heartland.
No.
Okay, really?
No. No.
Well, it's an
Refugee-
organization called the IRO that moved Jews to the heartland.
German-American Jewish leaders created the Industrial Removal Office in 1901 to remove unemployed Eastern
1901.
Jewish.
Hello, I'm not that old.
From its inception, just liquidation, in 1922, the IRO decided to do
No.
Okay, different IRO.
Different IRO. Honestly, now you've got me going. Can I look at it?
Okay.
It's gonna
Thank
drive you
you. Now
crazy.
I've got...
Rolling again.
Rolling. What time is it?
It is 12:41.
No. Well, I've got to finish before, I've got to be in Mercer Island at 2 o'clock. We'll be fine. Okay, International Refugee Organization, which took care of Jews, refugees, Jewish refugees. So these people were obviously guaranteeing my mother a place, a job. She would not be dependent on, and that's how they, on the country, on Canada. Now, she was a housekeeper. She had to be a housekeeper, really like indentured servant in a way. I mean, basically, and she couldn't take her 9-year-old child with her because she had to go work as a housekeeper. And so my parents decided first of all, my father, even if they weren't separated and so on, my father was quite successful in Vienna. Whoops, I shouldn't do that. My father was quite successful in Vienna. Take that out. I had sporadically seen my father, intermittently, but they decided I was going to go live with my father because my mother had to go, and after that she had to establish herself in Canada before she could bring me over and prove that she could, sustain me. And so they decided I was going to go live with my father. I did not know my father very well. I had seen him sporadically. I knew he was my father and that I loved him. I did. I loved him because he was my father, but I didn't know him very well. Anyway, I was just going to go live with him and be separated from my mother again. So this was my second big separation from my mother, and you can imagine I was very close to her. And so my sister had gone, was very close with my sister. And my sister, because she was so much older than me, in a way was sort of like a second mother. And we had a very close relationship. But so here I was going to live with my father, whom I really didn't know that well. My mother left, and she worked as a housekeeper for these people who adored her. And they saw that here she was a housekeeper, but she had servants. So apparently they had 2 teenage girls, and suddenly the 2 teenage girls had to make their beds. They wouldn't let my mother do this. They wouldn't let my mother do that. And she had a wonderful relationship with them, and they were wonderful to her. In fact, the lady, Mrs. Truchter, found out that my mother was sending all her money to her mother, to my grandmother in Budapest. So when they found out she was doing that, they just gave her more money and told her, you can't send all your money, you have to save some of your money for yourself. And then eventually my mother, after a year, which she had to do, left to get a job so she could start making money to support me and establish herself and bring me over. And she remained very close to these people and very good friends. My mother was a person who made friends, people loved her, and that's who she was. So I went to live with this man called my father, whom I knew was my father, and I had a really wonderful life with him. I learned to love him very much. I went to school. I remember every Saturday we would do something, go to a movie, a play, an opera, an operetta, no movies. So obviously I had a very good classical upbringing, really, concerts. I remember Vienna at that time, Vienna, well, Austria was an occupied country, and it was occupied by the four allies, France, United States, Russia, USSR, and France. And so the center of Vienna, which sort of was I remember it as a huge square. I guess it's the first of the divisions, because the Vienna is divided into sort of in the circles called the ring. Those are the districts of Vienna, and like we don't have those numbers there in Paris, for example. They have first district, second district. Well, Vienna is sort of the same way. And in the middle, in that center, there were sort of 4 corners, and in each corner there were the Russians, the French, the United States soldiers, and American, French, Russian, and English, British. And there were soldiers in each corners, and they just sort of, not many, and it was sort of, they were set up there, and they were always there because Austria was a nation sort of being governed by the 4 allies. I had some wonderful classmates. I went to school, had wonderful classmates, and I have a book, an autograph book that we all autographed and spent a lot of time putting in very special poems and thoughts and drawings and I still to this day have them, and very special. Then wrote my mother. We were constantly writing back and forth, and I always knew that I would eventually go with my mother. I did know that. One of the things is my father at that time, he had a chauffeur, and I would meet my father after school. School was from 8 o'clock in the morning till 1 in the afternoon. That's how the schools were. So you had lunch, a big lunch after that. So we would go to the same restaurant, the same table, same waiter every day. And sometimes when my father couldn't make it to pick me up at school, I would be picked up and taken to the restaurant, and then he would be picked up and meet me at the restaurant. And we had the same waiter that we loved and so on, that I loved, and knew. And I guess I'm a creature of habit, because there was something that I loved to eat, a special dish that I loved, lentils and sort of eggs sunny side up, whatever, and I ordered them. And finally my father said, you have to order something different. And so I always waited when he couldn't pick me up, because I'd be picked up first. So I got to the restaurant first. I'd order that first, because, he wanted me to eat some different things. Anyhow, finally, after 2 years, the time came, and my mother was able to send for me. And they decided that, we always knew that day would come. And my father, like I said, was doing well, and he would have been able to send me on the Queen Mary That was not possible. I had to be sent as a refugee, the same way my mother had been sent. And I had to be sent as a refugee, as an immigrant, again through the same era. And when the day came, or a few days before, probably, when my father begged me, would I stay with him? That was a very, very difficult time. That memory is a very sad memory and very difficult memory, because I loved him and I had to leave him. But there was never a question for 1 second that I would not go to my mother. There was just, again, but it was very, very difficult. He begged me to stay with him. I remember both of us crying. But there just was never a question of that. And so eventually, and by that time I was in first year gymnasium, which is the schooling in Europe, and I think it's still the same. You have 4 years of school, of elementary school, and then you have 8 years of what is called gymnasium, which prepares you for university. And they also have 4 years of high school, which is not preparatory for university. And I was in gymnasium, and by that time, so I was 10, and gymnasium is set up like high school, so different classes and so on. So you start much earlier in Europe, preparing for older grades and so on. So I remember Christmas time I was saying goodbye to all my classmates, and it was a very, very sad, difficult time for me to say goodbye to my classmates, to my teachers, and then to my father. And my journey coming to Canada started. The journey from Vienna was to go to Bremerhaven, which is a big port in Germany. And that journey is about 620 miles, that's all. And that journey took 5 months. I was being transferred. I was going through the system. And it started off leaving Vienna, and the first place was not that far from Vienna. It was a children's home, an orphanage, where there were other, I guess, Jewish refugees, which again, remember, I don't know anything about being Jewish. Let me go backtracking a little bit, because, this was important. So, remember, I had Catholic upbringing in Salzburg. Well, then I moved to Vienna, and that all stopped. of course, my father did not continue that. I had two best friends who were, I remember they had quite a lot of money. There was a governess and all that, and I was a lot with them. And they had Christmas and that. I knew nothing about religion. And this is a strange thing that occurred. I did not still know anything about being Jewish. I sort of knew, I guess my father said, no, you're not going to be Catholic. This is a strange thing, sort of like a void. There was no religion. I just stopped being a Catholic. My father, I guess, told me I wasn't Catholic. My friends were Protestant. I knew I wasn't Protestant. I was nothing, I guess. I knew I wasn't like them, but I didn't know what I was. And I don't know that if my father said that we were Jewish, I don't remember that. So that is sort of that was in the 2 years that I was in Vienna, because I was in Vienna for 2 years. And so back to the journey, we started, and my father, the first place was close enough to Vienna. My father visited me, and that really was the last time I saw him. And after that, like I said, over the 5 months, I went to a number of orphanages, children's homes, and I was basically alone with strangers and different kids. And one of the memories is having to take castor oil, which was horrible. No, not castor oil.
Cod liver oil.
Thank you. Cod liver oil. To this day, I remember the smell. It was awful. And we had to do that because it was for good health. And anyway, this was not I don't remember, this is not a happy time. In fact, I remember we all had lice at one point, which was terrible. Children's homes, orphanages, whatever. And eventually we arrived in Bremerhaven, and there was some barracks there. And I was put in a barrack with adults. At that point then, there were no children. There were just the sort of adults. There wasn't just children the way they had been in the orphanages. And we were there a couple of weeks waiting for the boat to come, and the ship. And it's still a bustling port, Bremerhaven, in Germany. And then finally we boarded the ship. And what's interesting is I found this ship, the exact ship that I was on the internet. I looked in one of my papers, gave the name of the ship, and I found that picture of that ship on the internet, which is, I think, fascinating. That ship had been converted during the war for soldiers. And so there's a huge, huge room for women and a huge, huge room for men to sleep. And I was brought by somebody to this woman and said, if you have a problem, just go to this woman. So basically I was by myself. Well, the whole time, that 5 months, was by myself. I know that it was not a happy time for me. I'm sure I missed my mother and my father terribly. But I did not cry. I did not. I guess I was pretty lonely. And so here we are on the ship. It started, and the voyage took 9 months. 9 months, excuse me. The voyage took 9 days. And what I remember from that voyage is just being very ill, very sick. Big garbage cans that I managed to upchuck into. It was a very awful voyage, really, because it was a lot of storms and stuff. And I don't imagine the ship wasn't that big, I guess, so you really felt the waves. It was not a good voyage. Eventually, so then we arrived in Halifax, and in Halifax, I was transferred. And the only good thing there was another little girl. She was about my age, and she and I were both put on the train together. And I remember having the cards, with the identity, and they put money in and our identification. And here we are in this country where we don't speak the language. And we're put on a train, and we were really, I guess, really fortunate because every time the conductors changed, they changed shifts. The voyage took three nights and 2 days. They got us pillows because we were sitting up for those 3 nights and 2 days. And I guess they took money for whatever money was provided in here for us to, and they took care of every time the shift. They took care of buying food for us because we did not speak the language. And so I arrived in Toronto first. She was going further. She was going 100 miles further to London, Ontario. I was going to Toronto, Ontario. So the conductor, time for me to get off. I said goodbye to the little girl. And unfortunately, there was no such thing as exchanging communication, each other's names, which is sad when you think about it. I've often thought about it as an adult. It would have been so nice, but I guess we didn't even think of it. I got off the train. I was looking for my mother. I speak no language. I've got a little suitcase with me. I speak no language. I don't speak English, except hello, goodbye, a couple words like that. And I look for my mother, and I don't see my mother because they did not allow, they only allowed passengers on the platform instead of, so I am sure that I was terrified. Again, I must have been. I remember looking around and I saw everybody was walking in a direction. I started walking in that direction, walking up a ramp. I followed everybody up a ramp. I didn't know where I was going. I don't speak the language. I don't see my mother. Pretty scary, very scary. And suddenly I saw my mother. And that was it. That was the most exciting thing in the world for me. And then when my mother took me to her apartment, there was my old quilt. She had somehow taken that with her. And I remember flying to the quilt and lying down on it. I was so excited. It just meant so much to me. And that was my arrival in Toronto. And now, do we stop here?
No, I'd like to ask you a few more questions. But yeah, I think we're getting close to the
end. That's my journey. That is my journey. I, had to learn English. My mother sent me to Jewish day school. Well, actually, there's another thing. So, not Jewish day school, Jewish day camp. First, we visited my sister in San Antonio, Texas. And we stopped in New York and visited an aunt and uncle. And they were not my real aunt and uncle, but I called them my aunt and uncle. Very close friends of my mother's. And they have a story that their story was incredible, heartrending. But anyway, they went to Jewish day camp and I learned English. I went to school, learned English. And that's when I started learning about being Jewish. I heard the word Jewish. I was Jewish. And my mother made sure that she had already had the Hungarian and Austrian, they had a social club and everything. And so anyway, she started exposing me to being Jewish. So I guess at that point, my mother realized that was very important. That's our heritage. And being Catholic was just a time that she had done to protect her child. And and so slowly I started learning being Jewish. And I had Jewish friends and non-Jewish friends. And started learning about different the Jewish religion from friends. But still, my mother was not religious in terms of even really at that time taking me to synagogue, just sort of had an exposure. And then I had one very unfortunate incident happen to me when I was about 13, where I was cornered and I was called a dirty Jew and so on. And I had this very close friend, and she actually was Estonian, and she also was a child of war, but she was not Jewish, she was Christian. And after I'd been called this, and it really left me quite traumatized, because I didn't even understand that totally, this hatred of being just because I was Jewish. And so I turned a little bit into Judas because I said to her, I have a secret to tell you. Please don't tell anybody, but I'm really not Jewish. And I told her that I'd had, catechism and communion, and that I wasn't really Jewish. And after that, psychologically, and I was 13, and after that, psychologically, I had a very, very difficult time of terrible guilt, a real angst, and more and more, and it lasted a number of months where I felt very guilty. I was denying my religion that I was really just had learned about and so on, and knew that that was a lie, that I was Jewish, once, because by that time I understood my whole background was that and so on. And so for me, this was a very, very difficult psychological time, and I couldn't tell my mother because I felt guilty. I didn't know what to say to her. And the guilt just built up in me till I finally decided to take a trip. And I have to stop here for a minute. One of the things, and this is, I think, important, I don't know if you're going to put that in, because, and this happened to a lot of Jews, but in order for the priest to save us, we all had to be baptized. A lot of Jews, he wouldn't have been able to, as far as his bishop or whatever it was, but we all had to be baptized. So we were all baptized. So that's how I was able to even have catechism. I had baptismal papers. I was Catholic. In name, whatever. So, okay, back to this terrible time of 13 and feeling guilty, to the point that I didn't know what to do with myself. I didn't know who to go to. And I knew I knew there was this big church in downtown, close to downtown Toronto, that I passed, and I decided to take myself there one Saturday morning and go to confession, because I did not know who to turn to, who to talk to. And so I went to confession, first time since I was 8 years old, and to talk to somebody, and I talked to the priest. And I was in that confessional for probably a good hour, because I told him the story of my whole life and my guilt and what I felt like. I had somebody to talk to and to tell. And I was very, very fortunate, and to this day, I am so grateful to this priest. I always thought that this was a younger priest, not an older priest. And the reason I thought that is because after hearing my story, he said, "You come from a long line of Jews, both on your mother and your father's side, and you are Jewish." And basically, he gave me permission to walk out of that confessional and be Jewish, and never having to look back, and never having to deny it, and not. He absolved me of all the guilt that I felt, and gave me my identity. I never saw his face. You don't in a confessional. I just know that he was a younger man, because I think had it been an older priest, here was a chance to take this young girl who was so confused. He could have had me totally, and I think an older priest would have done that, try and to have a Catholic. And I think that's why I think he was just a younger priest. And for me, he saved my life in terms of how it affected me for the rest of my life. Because like I said, I walked out of there and I know who I was. He gave me an identity, my identity. And to this day, I'm grateful to him, because it meant a lot to me. And it has meant a lot to me, because I brought up my children, obviously Jewish, with bars and bat mitzvahs, my grandchildren, all very, very important to me. That's probably a good place to end, isn't it?
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah, we don't need to know about what I did and where I moved.
Questions for you. One is, I just like to give you the opportunity to say a little bit more about your mother, she just sounded so decisive and so brave, and
She was. Well, let me tell you another little story about my mother. So I told you about my uncle Oladar. And He was a wonderful, charming, loving, always told jokes man, but he was really not very brave. Now, he was in a working camp as a Jewish young man during the war. That's what they did with Jewish, they had work camps where they were treated horribly, but they weren't soldiers, they were work camps for Jews, for young Jewish men. I don't know if you know that in Hungary during the war, even though they weren't, they could, they were protected, but they were not, Jews weren't treated well, of course. They all still had that stigma and were not treated well, so when the Nazis took over and started deporting the Hungarian Jews, his sergeant or whoever was in charge of him, he was a lovely man who everybody loved. He told him to go AWOL because he would have been deported. That's what they did with all these Jewish young boys, young men. And he told them to leave because that's how he was saved. And my older uncle, he got typhus and he died that way. But my other uncle he escaped and went into hiding. Well, but he was not a very brave man. My mother they had a relationship which was incredible. She sent him money, she bought him a car, blah, blah, blah. And so then the Hungarian Revolution came in 1956. And he had a girlfriend at the time, and she told him she was younger than he was, and she said, "We're leaving." And he was just too afraid to leave, and he stayed in Budapest. Basically, I remember in the year 1956, our home was open to, I don't know how many different families lived with us during that time. My mother opened her home to anybody that she heard about that needed a place to stay, refugees that were escaping from the 1956 revolution against the Soviets, which was a very big thing. His girlfriend was with us and, of course, became part of the family and so on. And I went back with my mother to visit twice, and it was still communist, and especially the first time in 1975, you just was really... Hungary, after the 56 revolution, though, was more free than Poland and Czechoslovakia. They were allowed more things. So, again, my mother was taking care of her brother from Canada. And one summer she brought Kalman and my uncle over. And basically my mother remarried. And basically her children were always the most important. My sister also eventually moved to Toronto. So we were together, my nephew, my sister, and I, and my mother. And we were very, very close, the three of us, always. My sister, unfortunately, got Parkinson's, and my mother wound up taking care of my sister. She was an incredible lady. So you want to ask questions?
Did you communicate with your father?
Okay, very much so. Communicated with my father. My father remarried. Communicated with my father. He actually had a child. And he was a little boy. And unfortunately, he became ill. And my mother sent him medication. My mother and my stepfather he was a doctor, my stepfather, sent him medicines because he couldn't do the business anymore, whatever. And he died in 1956, so I never got a chance to go back. We had plans for me to go back, but, between all the things that happened, I never did see him again, but communicated all the time, yes.
Your father died in 1956.
My father died, and I was 16 years old, and my father died.
Child?
So when my father died, this child was 3 years old, and when my father died, we tried to communicate, and I knew she had been his girlfriend, I guess, so I knew her. I remember her. She just stopped communicating with us, and so I have a half brother somewhere, or I had a half brother somewhere, but I never. I didn't know him, and so I've never felt. It sounds so. He is on my if he's still alive, I've never tried, and I really didn't try to do anything. Now, my brother-in-law, my sister's husband, later on in life, he tried. He was very interested in looking, and he wrote a book too, and so, about his experience. And so he was very interested, and he tried to find him. And I said, Fred, fine. I've never had any kind of a feeling to do that because he didn't just mean anything to me, but he never did find him. And so, which is sort of in a way sad because I guess he's family, but he's really not. I don't know how you would, I don't know. So that was basically it. But it was very sad that I never, we wrote back and forth, but I never saw him again. That's a very sad thing. In fact, when I talk to the classes, they ask me that a lot. And that's something I've regretted. And my mother continued to be a loving, loving grandmother. My children adored my mother. And even after, we moved to Montreal, and I lived there for 10 years, and my mother came every 6 weeks and stayed with us for a week. And when we moved here, she'd come here quite often. So my children, and she talked to them about the war. And they loved sitting around and listening to Grandma Esther. And we still sit around the table talking about Grandma Esther. And my grandchildren, of course, my grandchildren never know her, But, we're eating Grandma Esther's this and that. And sometimes we talk, and you would think that my grandchildren knew my mother. She's just such a, somebody in our lives that has even affected my grandchildren. This is Grandma Esther's this, and this is Grandma Esther that, even though they didn't know her. Very, very big influence on my children's lives. And the sad thing is that my sister, who was much older during the war, really wasn't able to talk much about the war. Very typical. I can just imagine, But we were very close.
So one more question for you, and this is something we ask everyone at the end of the taping. Alana wants to put together a compilation of all the. I'll ask you the question, and you
Okay.
understand. Do you have any message or advice for young people today?
My message to young people and old people, let's not forget, we are all the same inside. It doesn't matter what we look like outside, on the outside. It doesn't matter what religion we practice. We are all the same. And if we could only treat each other that way and not differentiate between this religion or that religion or the skin color or facial features. Unfortunately, today, this is what happens. This is what people do. A lot of people don't do that. We are all the same. I was persecuted because I had a different religion. Today, people are persecuted because of religions or their skin color. We are all the same. We should treat each other all the same. And then we would never have the experiences that I've had to have, or others during the Holocaust, or the experiences that people today in 2018 are still suffering all over the world. And they still are. There are many places in the world that people are being persecuted because of their skin color and because of their religion. We must stop doing that. That's my message.
Well, thank you, Agi. That's a nice message. I have one more request. Can you show us the blanket?
It's an eiderdown.
Yeah.
Sure. I don't use
Get
it.
some
But,
shoes on. I don't want you to slip.
oh yeah, where are my shoes?
They're
Here
over
they
there.
are. Yeah, because I have to go in the garage. That was amazing. It's funny. People today here in the United States, Canada, sleep with eiderdown. But in Europe, when I came here, people.
Until you sit down. This be part of it.
Oh,
You get
oh,
up
you're
there.
kidding.
Yeah,
Oh.
we want to get this on.
Oh, well,
We're talking about a blanket.
not a blanket. Are you gonna
It's a
help me?
comforter.
Yeah, it's a eiderdown.
Yeah.
Do you want to? Shall I open it? I mean,
Yeah, if you want to.
well, I don't know. It's under. I guess it's. Oh. I don't know. How do you open it now? Right.
That's for them to go away.
You have to.
Okay, you guys can do that. Oh, okay.
It's a Ziploc.
Oh, there we go.
Take that whole thing out, but
Yeah.
Okay. Oh my God. Can you believe this? Huh. This has gone through a lot of things, hasn't it? So this is my eiderdown comforter that was on the bottom of the rowboat that my mother somehow, I guess she knew it meant a lot to me. I don't know. I remember, and then my mother took it with her to Canada, to Toronto. And the first thing I did when we went into her apartment, I saw the eiderdown, screamed, and just flew myself over it and lay down on it. And I slept with this eiderdown my whole teenage years, in Toronto. And I slept with this eiderdown until I got married. And then my mother had a bigger eiderdown comforter made for me, because this is a fairly small one, not big enough for two people. And the interesting thing is, today, this is an eiderdown comforter. Eiderdown is, the feathers. Today, everybody sleeps with that, right? Well, in Europe, we did not sleep with blankets. We only slept with feather comforters. Well, when I came to Canada, people slept with blankets. I, of course, always had an eiderdown, right? So when we got married, my mother, we were looking for to have an eiderdown made for us, because there was no way I would sleep with a blanket. This was too small. And we lived in Toronto, big city, right? There were no people that made eiderdowns. There were no eiderdown companies that made eiderdowns. My mother found a place in New York where there were a lot of Hungarian Jews, especially Hungarians. I don't know why, but that is the eiderdown comforter is a thing that especially, not that Austrian and German did too, but she found Hungarian Jews who had a big eiderdown factory in New York, and she had a big one made for us. And I don't remember when eiderdowns actually, or comforters as people call them, became popular here. Because now, I guess everybody has them. But my growing up and my first years as an adult, people slept with blankets. And I remember going to somebody's house and I thought, oh my God, I had to sleep with a blanket. I hated it. So this is a very special thing.
How does it feel when you're holding this?
It brings back memories. It does. I haven't held it for a long time. I keep it in a big plastic bag because it is small, and I have a queen-size bed, and I have a big queen-size comforter. I've had a few iterations of them, but I actually even found a company here that custom makes them, and mine is custom made from here because I have more feathers put in than normal or whatever. It's just something I grew up with, and I guess that's what I have. But everybody does sleep with eiderdowns, and of course my children did. I've never slept with blankets, nor did my children, nor my grand. But of course by now nobody does. I don't think. I don't know. So it feels like home, I think. And I think that's what this was. I think this was, because of my moving around, I remember when I had to leave my father in Vienna, one of the saddest things for me and the most difficult things for me, I was a very avid reader. I read a lot. After I was put to bed under the blanket with the light, right, when I was supposed to be asleep. And I had to leave a wonderful, wonderful library of my books. And that was one of the saddest things for me. So I think for me, probably this was the same thing. I had a piece of something that belonged to me because of my traveling around and living in the orphanages and living with people. This was something that belonged to me. So it was and I think that's what this represents to me. And I remember having my own room. I think home means a lot to me because of of my background. I like having my things and my home gives me comfort, and this gave me comfort.
And it strikes me also as we listen to your testimony that, you know, your childhood was somehow taken from you, and this is
I definitely, my childhood, I think a lot of Holocaust survivors, you don't have a childhood. You don't have a normal, certainly not what a normal childhood is, which certainly I try to give to my children and my grandchildren, and my children give to their children. I'm very close to my grandchildren. I think it's very important. I saw how my mother was with my children. And so I emulated. I've emulated my mother a lot. I'm very much like my mother in a lot of ways. I don't know if I would be as brave as she was. And you never know how, one never knows how one's going to react unless they're put into the situation. I think there were a lot of brave people during the war, and there still are today, doing things, to do anything. And for my mother, her children were the most important things in the world. She always reiterated that. And as far as being loving and warm, here was my grandmother who was not. I remember my sister did not like my mother's mother. She, like I said, she was not warm. And my mother was like totally the opposite, And basically, I guess I'm that way with my mother, and I'm with my children and my grandchildren. So I'm very lucky because now they're 21, 19, and 19. And I have a very close relationship with each one of them, an individual relationship with each one of them. And that to me is the most important thing. And yeah, I did not have a childhood. There were many times. Separation was a big thing too. Being separated from your mother, as often as I was separated, left the void. And I think though my mother realized that, because the outpouring of love from her and her was immense. So I guess she did make up. I don't guess. She made up for it, because I honestly, obviously I have certain things that are a reflection of that. But one of the things that my son said to me, I took him to there was a Hidden Children here in Seattle, not a big group, but Steve Adler was there, part of that. And we had a second generation come. Now, I'm one of the youngest survivors because I was born in 1940. And so when I brought my son, and this was, probably at least 15 years ago, it was about 35. And I brought him, we decided to bring some second generations in for a meeting. And the other second generations were much older more my age than his age. And so he was talking to this second generation person, and he really couldn't understand their experiences at all. He couldn't, compare anything. And when we left, he said, Mom, my daughter wasn't able to come. She had something that day. And he said, Mom, thank you for bringing me up normal, because the other person was affected. And my children were not brought up as Holocaust survivors, generations, which a lot of the older people, for lack of being able to talk to them, there are many reasons, their fears, etc. So I brought them up normally, and he thanked me for that, for being normal. So that was an important thing. And he recognized and realized that. So
it strikes me that this is sort of remnant from your childhood, this symbol that your mother held for you is, the warm embrace, right? When you get under it, you feel that warmth of your mother.
Yeah, I do. And I did. As I said, I slept with it for many, many years. And now, I look at it and I think, well, let's see, it's too small, really, it's for one person, but maybe, I don't know, maybe one of my grandchildren will take it for their children. I don't know. I sort of not forgot about it, but I'm at the age now and stage where I keep thinking, there's certain things you want your children to have, you know. Of course, they don't want to hear about that. They don't want to talk about it. You know, they don't want to think that way. Even my children don't.
Is that hard for you not to be able to communicate those things?
It's not a matter of communication. Kids don't want to hear about you dying. So, Mom, don't worry about it. We'll figure it out. And my children say, you know. But, I mean, there are certain things that they know are going to go to them, or I want them. You know, you can't dictate from your grave. And we all try. But you know, you say there's certain things. My mother was able to save this ring and this bracelet. She sewed it inside her clothes. She had this made in the 30s. Now, she snuck a couple pieces of jewelry, and these are two things. And of course, they're going to go to my daughter and then to my granddaughter, because they were grandmasters. But how were they saved? Well, these were saved by sewing them inside of clothes and taking your chance when you escaped that they wouldn't be. And a lot of times, people had their coats ripped open and they found them. But so she was able to save a couple things like that, and that was about it. So, and my mother had this ring on her finger always. And then when she decided to, I mean, it was always going to be mine, but she decided to give it to me a few years before she died. And I couldn't wear it. I had it in the safe. And I didn't wear it till, actually, I decided to wear it once. On my 50th birthday, my mother forgot my birthday, and that was the first sign of her forgetting and senility. And then I took it out of the safe and have worn it, and I wear it pretty well every day because I feel my mother when I have this ring. And that is, you know, so even for this talk, this is why I'm wearing this, because, yeah, she's with me this way. But she always had this on her finger, and I have it on my finger, and my daughter loves it, my granddaughter loves it, and they're not going to change it. It's Grandmaster's ring, and they love it as it is, and it means something to them. And even my granddaughter, who, like I said, I have a big portrait of my mother that was painted when she was 36. No, she was painted in 1936. So she was 32 years old, 4 years before I was born. And she was able to bring that. You couldn't take anything out of Hungary, anything original, but she was eventually able to take it out rolled. And so I've had it, and it's in my bedroom. And that's going to go to my daughter said she would hang it, and even my granddaughter is going to. It's an original portrait. In those days, you sat for portraits, and it's a beautiful portrait. So that's going to be perpetuated anyway to that.
And you carry this ring on you, and you carry sort of the memory of your...
I carry my mother here with me, yeah.
In what way, when you pass on this ring, how, you know, you've been speaking to schools, you've been speaking at the center, you know, in what way is it important to both pass on sort of the memories of your family through the ring, but also the stories?
The stories, I think, for the classrooms. I mean, this is very personal. For the classrooms, I've been very gratified in that the children's reactions, and I've talked to some adults too, very different. It really impacts them. Really impacts them they come up to me afterwards that they have actually talking to a person who's gone through this. You know, they study it in school, they do different aspects of it. But I think people like me, we bring reality to them because this is a real human being. Like, I'm telling my story, and and they're hearing this story firsthand. And this is a real human being who's experienced it, just like that girl from Rwanda. You know, I mean, it really impacts kids to understand. It's more than they read Night, and I mean, it is a wonderful book and so on, but to actually talk to someone who's gone through those things, it really has an impact on them. one of my most favorite, not favorite, memorable things is I was at one school, I think they were grade 8, and this young boy comes up to me, and he says, "Can I give you a hug?" And in this day and age, people, in schools, you're not supposed to do that anymore. Blah blah blah. I was a teacher, by the way, so it seems to me ridiculous. Anyway, can I give you a hug? And I said, of course. And we hugged. And then he and I talked a little bit. There was another young girl beside him, and we were talking. And then we're saying goodbye, and he hugged me. He asked to hug me again, and we hugged again. And just at that time, so we're hugging, and then he sort of leaves, and 2 teachers came up to me to say something. And they come up to me, and they said, "You hugged," I don't remember his name, "but you hugged whatever his name was." And I said, "Yes." And they said, and then tears welled up in their eyes. They said, "He's autistic. He doesn't hug people." So then the 3 of us were crying, because how meaningful that he asked to hug me twice. And that's the impact I had on him. And this was an autistic, and he was also a bit, what do you call it, syndrome? Tourette's syndrome. So he had some Tourette's syndrome, and he was autistic, which of course is on the same. And he asked to hug me twice. So that is what is gratifying, that that it means something to the kids.
And why is it so important that they can make sense or meaning out of it?
Why? Well, even I try and finish, and the way you asked me what it means with the messages, and I've been lately finishing with something that I've added, which is just a very small thing from that John F. Kennedy read, which is basically saying the same thing. I finish my lectures with that. For them it means a lot for them to understand, one, how important it is to not have any prejudices. 2, to realize that we human beings in different ways can go through many ups and downs, maybe a lot of downs, but you can survive them. And that they too would be capable of experiencing things that maybe are not necessarily the best, and that you can survive them. And for them to also understand, again, the ending, how to understand that we are all the same, that we have to not bully, we have to not be prejudiced. I think that, and I think that's what they are getting that out of learning about the Holocaust and hearing, people like me talk to them.
And you're speaking right now in a moment in time in history that's
very
vastly
important.
different than 10 years ago even, and you, among the young survivors left, see things like, your fellow Hungarian Soros, right, being villainized and Tree of Life massacres, and you're telling these stories of the past. In what way does it matter to you to keep speaking right now?
Well, precisely for that reason. Right now, politically, we all know we're not in a very good situation. 57% anti-Semitism. I mean, it's risen. We have, as Jews. I think I try and take it past being Jewish, though. I think that's important, because anti-Semitism has gone up a lot. I look at one of my grandchildren wears a Magen David. I would never wear a Magen David in public. I have certain fears. When I walk into a group of people I don't know, I very quickly ascertain somehow in different ways to let people know I'm Jewish. And that's the protection of myself, because I've been in situations where it's been terribly uncomfortable, where they're denigrating things said about Jews. So I protect myself by somehow into the conversation, I let people know I'm Jewish. I'm so delighted that my grandson can wear a Mogen David when he's he feels proud to wear that, and he just one of them. That's what he does, and that makes that they never felt that. My children and my grandchildren never felt that. But I do try, like I said, it goes further than just being Jewish. And yes, living in this day and age when there's so much going on with our president, don't get me started on that. Yeah, it's very important. And I think basically, what's interesting is that classes that do teach the Holocaust and the teachers and the classrooms, they're very versatile, they're very diverse. And I guess we don't do that in the very right classrooms and teachers. So, my exposure and their exposure to me, my exposure to them, they're people that are diverse and forward-thinking, not what's going on with the other part of our country. So it's, does it affect me as being Jewish? Of course, I've lived with that all my life, ever since I was put in that corner called the dirty Jew. So yeah, do I protect myself? Absolutely. It's not a comfortable situation, but I'm delighted that my children don't have that. So thank God for that.
And you said one of your dreams is to go to Rwanda to see the gorillas. If I may ask, also that if you could share that dream, but also that takes a certain amount of bravery for you to know what you're walking into in terms of the genocide of that country. And how you imagine that journey that you... Unimaginable, because the atrocities there that took place. I mean, wow. I can't imagine it. I think it brings back a fear for me, probably. I think deep down, that's what I have. I'm sure I have that fear of being racially marked or recognized. And I guess that would be fear. And that's interesting you're bringing that up, because I don't think I've ever labeled that as such, and now I'm labeling that. That's interesting, because it is a fear. It strikes me that you're going to go to encounter the guerrillas, but what you'll see is a genocide that has happened after your genocide. And that's got to be, for a Holocaust survivor, something that I can only imagine.
And probably couldn't imagine it unless I was there. Because, but even the genocide of the I'm not saying it right. I don't know. Like if I went to a camp in Bangladesh, I don't know how I would react. I don't know if I could even, I could do it because I can do anything. I do have my mother's resolve and strength. But I think that would, and the other thing is, as I'm giving these talks and I'm bringing it more and more into light, and the Hidden Children's Conference has helped a lot. Because the one thing is, before I attended the Hidden Children's Conferences, I talked about my experiences in third person, sort of. It was as if I didn't let myself become emotionally involved. I could talk about my experiences with no emotional involvement. Then when I went to a number of Hidden Children's Conferences, where you meet in different groups with different people who have all different kinds of, then the emotions came out. The other thing that they found is they found that this is the time that we were able to start experiencing things emotionally in about our 50s, middle age. So before that, I was not involved. Then middle age, we started emotionally experiencing, the Holocaust survivors. Until then, it wasn't an emotional experience. And then that brought that out. So now when I hear some of the things or even watch things, I can't stop crying. So it's really interesting. And it does take something emotionally out of me when I'm, what time is it, by the way?
It's 20 to 2, we should probably get...
What time? Oh, I think I better leave. So it brings out emotionally in me, now I have an emotional thing. You know what, I'm going to have to leave you guys to close up my house. because I have to be on Mercer Island, and I can't be late. So if you don't mind, just
No.
shut the light, shut the door. I'll take my dog out quickly, and then I'll put him downstairs. And if you don't mind putting things together for me.
Put everything back together.
You don't mind?
Thank you,
Okay.
Aggie.
Thank you, thank you.
Wonderful to meet you,
Lovely to
too.
meet you, really lovely.
Yeah,
You are,
and I would love to help you on that journey to the
well,
goal
if I
someday.
end up with someday, if I'm gonna do it, I don't have that much time, I'll tell you.
Well, I'll give you a card. And,
Yes, that would be great.
And, this is an old card.
Thank you, yeah, please, thank you, thank you. Pepper,